Millionaire is forced to abandon her baby. 25 years later, she freezes upon seeing a waitress identical to her at a luxury restaurant. She approached. The soft hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware filled the opulent dining room of Bellisario, one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants. The crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm, golden glow, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the sleek modern decor. It was a place where the city's elite came to see and be seen, a fitting backdrop for Madeline Harper, who sat at her usual table near the towering windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, her platinum blonde hair swept into a sophisticated chignon. Madeline exuded control and authority. Her posture was straight, her expression composed. A glass of sparkling water sat untouched in front of her, its condensation pooling into a delicate ring on the tablecloth. From the outside, she appeared the picture of composure, but inside, her mind churned with calculations. The merger on the table today was critical, one that could cement Harper Enterprises as the most dominant player in the real estate industry. She adjusted the diamond cuff on her wrist, her gaze scanning the room out of habit. That's when her eyes landed on her. A young woman, no older than 25, moved gracefully between the tables, a tray balanced effortlessly in her hand. Her brown hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves. Catching the light as she leaned down to take an order, Madeline's breath caught in her throat. There was something strikingly familiar about the woman. Her poise, her features, the way she carried herself. Madeline couldn't look away. The woman straightened, her profile now in full view. Large almond-shaped eyes, a delicate nose, a graceful neck. Madeline's grip tightened on her glass. She knew that face. But how? "Miss Harper," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Madeline turned to see her assistant, Robert, standing by her side with a sleek tablet in hand. His brow furrowed slightly, a sign he was about to ask something important. "The investors will be arriving shortly," he said. "Would you like me to confirm the arrangements with the private room?" Madeline hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the young woman. She was weaving her way toward another table, a soft smile on her lips as she set down a tray of sparkling drinks. "Mrs. Harper," Robert prompted again. "Yes," Madeline said, her voice distant. "Yes, confirm it, but give me a moment." Robert tilted his head slightly, his confusion evident, but nodded. "Of course, ma'am." Madeline's eyes followed the waitress as she made her way closer, the room fading into a blur of muted colors and indistinct sounds. The young woman's every movement seemed to strike a chord deep within her, a chord Madeline hadn't felt in years. Finally, as the waitress passed her table, Madeline raised her hand. "Excuse me, miss." The woman turned, her polite smile lighting up her face. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Madeline was momentarily stunned, words failing her. Up close, the resemblance was even more uncanny. Those eyes, they mirrored her own from decades ago. Before the years had hardened her gaze, Madeline cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "I'd like a refill of water, please." The waitress nodded, picking up the glass from the table. "Of course, I'll be right back." As the woman walked away, Madeline's heart raced, a rare and unfamiliar sensation for someone who prided herself on being unshakable. She turned to Robert, her voice low and urgent. "Find out who she is." Robert blinked. "The waitress." "Yes, her name, her background." "Everything." Robert hesitated, clearly taken aback by the unusual request. "I'll see what I can do." Madeline leaned back in her chair, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Could it be? Could this young woman be the daughter she had been forced to abandon all those years ago? Her thoughts were interrupted when the waitress returned with the glass of water. "Thank you," Madeline said, her tone softer than usual. The waitress gave a polite nod, her expression kind yet professional. "Anything else I can get for you, ma'am?" Madeline hesitated, then asked, "What's your name?" The waitress paused, her smile unwavering. "Charlotte, ma'am. Charlotte Walker." The name hung in the air, heavy with implications. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it didn't quiet the storm brewing in Madeline's chest either. "Thank you, Charlotte," she said, her voice tinged with an uncharacteristic warmth. Charlotte moved on to another table, leaving Madeline to sit in silence, staring at the condensation on her glass. As the investors arrived and the meeting commenced, Madeline went through the motions, her practiced smile and polished demeanor in place, but her thoughts remained on Charlotte. That night, in the quiet solitude of her penthouse, Madeline stared out at the city skyline, the lights below twinkling like stars. Her mind wandered back to a time she had tried so hard to forget, a time of love, loss, and impossible decisions. She thought of the young woman at the restaurant and the questions that now consumed her. "I need to know," she whispered to herself, and with that, she resolved to uncover the truth, no matter what it might reveal. The steady rhythm of rain tapped against the large windows of Madeline Harper's penthouse. She sat at her desk, a glass of wine in hand, staring at a photo frame lying face down. The room, usually a reflection of her disciplined life, now felt like a prison. Each shadow on the wall, whispering memories she had fought to bury. She reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the frame upright. The black and white photograph revealed a younger Madeline with a radiant smile, her arm wrapped around a man whose charm was evident even through the faded print. Michael. The name alone was enough to send a pang through her chest. Michael, the man who had taught her what love truly meant, only for that love to be ripped away by her father's iron will. She leaned back, her head resting against the chair, as the memories came flooding back. It was a warm summer evening. 26 years ago, Madeline had snuck out of the Harper estate, leaving behind the suffocating world of high society for the rolling fields of her family's countryside property. She had always found solace in the simplicity of the farm, but it wasn't the fields that had drawn her that night. It was Michael. He had been a farmhand, his rough hands and sun-kissed skin a testament to his hard work. Michael had a laugh that could light up the darkest night, and a way of looking at her that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. Their love had been a secret, one they guarded fiercely, knowing the consequences if her father, Edward Harper, ever found out. But secrets, as Madeline had learned, never stayed buried for long. When her father discovered their relationship, the fallout had been swift and merciless. Edward had threatened Michael's life, promising ruin if he didn't leave. And then there was the pregnancy, a revelation that had sent Edward into a fury. "You'll destroy this family's reputation," he had spat, his voice cold and unyielding. "You will end this, Madeline. Or I will," she had pleaded, begged for him to let her keep the baby, to let her and Michael have a chance at happiness. But Edward's word was law. He had arranged for the baby to be taken to an orphanage, ensuring that no one would ever know. And just like that, Madeline's world had crumbled. She had watched as Michael was driven away, his silhouette disappearing into the horizon, and later, she had been forced to hand over her newborn daughter to strangers. The memory of her tiny face, her cries, had haunted Madeline every day since. Now, sitting in her dimly lit office, she realized she had spent years building walls around herself to protect from the pain. Yet, in a single moment at the restaurant, Charlotte's face had shattered those walls. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her back to the present. It was Robert. "I found some basic information about the waitress," he said. His voice professional but tinged with curiosity. Madeline's breath hitched. "Go on." "Her name is Charlotte Walker. She's 25, works full-time at the restaurant, and studies part-time at a local college. Grew up in an orphanage, St. Miriam's here in New York." Madeline gripped the edge of her desk. St. Miriam's. The name was like a ghost from her past, pulling her back to the day she had stood outside its gates, clutching a tiny bundle to her chest. "Anything else?" she managed to ask. "Not yet, but I'll dig deeper if you'd like," Robert offered, sensing her hesitation. "Yes," she said firmly. "I need to know everything." After ending the call, Madeline stood and paced the room, her emotions warred within her. Hope, fear, guilt, and a simmering anger that had never quite cooled Edward. He had orchestrated everything, ensured her daughter would be hidden away, erased from her life. Did he know where she was all along? The thought made her blood boil. Edward Harper had controlled every aspect of her life, shaping her into the perfect successor for the Harper Empire. But he had taken too much. Madeline turned to the window, the city's lights stretching endlessly before her. For the first time in years, the carefully constructed life she had built felt empty. What was all her success worth if it had been built on a foundation of loss and regret? Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who had conquered boardrooms and commanded respect, yet couldn't confront her own past. She reached for her phone again, this time searching for the number of an old contact, a private investigator she had used in the past for corporate espionage. If there was anyone who could uncover the truth, it was him. "Mr. Stein," she said when he answered, "I have a job for you." As she outlined the details of what she needed, a sense of determination began to replace her hesitation. This wasn't just about finding out if Charlotte was her daughter. It was about reclaiming the part of herself that had been stolen. When the call ended, Madeline felt a weight lift ever so slightly. For the first time in years, she had a purpose that wasn't tied to her father's legacy or her business empire. But with that purpose came the risk of reopening old wounds. And if Charlotte truly was her daughter, would she ever be able to forgive Madeline for abandoning her? Madeline pushed the thought aside, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. Tomorrow, she would begin piecing together the truth. For now, she let herself hold on to a small flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she could fix what had been broken. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the small apartment, casting soft golden light across the modest furniture. Charlotte Walker sat at the tiny kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as she flipped through pages of her worn-out textbook, pausing occasionally to jot down notes. It was a Saturday, which meant she had a few precious hours to focus on her studies before heading to her shift at Bellisario. Between her job as a waitress and her part-time college classes, time was a luxury Charlotte rarely had. She took a sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth as she glanced at a vision board pinned to the wall above her desk. It was a collage of magazine clippings, handwritten notes, and sketches. At the center was a bold title she had scrawled in red ink: "My Own Cafe." It had been her dream for as long as she could remember. A cozy space where people could gather, share stories, and feel at home. Growing up in St. Miriam's orphanage, Charlotte had often escaped into books, imagining a life where she could create a place of comfort and belonging for others. But dreams didn't pay the bills, and reality often felt like an endless uphill climb. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from her roommate, Emma, a cheerful redhead who was away visiting family for the weekend. "Emma, don't work too hard. The world needs more Charlottes with big dreams." Charlotte smiled, typing back a quick reply before closing her textbook with a sigh. She loved Emma's optimism, but some days, her dreams felt farther away than ever. After washing her coffee cup and pulling her dark hair into a neat ponytail, Charlotte grabbed her uniform and headed out the door. The streets of New York buzzed with activity as Charlotte made her way to Bellisario. The restaurant was her lifeline, both a source of income and an unintentional stage where she could observe the lives of the city's elite. Once inside, she changed into her crisp white blouse and black slacks, tying a black apron around her waist. She greeted her co-workers with a warm smile, her easygoing nature making her well-liked among the staff. "Double shift today?" asked Julia, one of the senior waitresses, as they set up the dining room. "Yeah," Charlotte replied, adjusting a table setting. "Gotta make sure tuition gets paid," Julia chuckled. "You're a trooper. If anyone deserves a break, it's you." Charlotte shrugged, brushing off the compliment. She didn't mind the hard work. It kept her focused and gave her a sense of purpose. As the lunch crowd began to trickle in, Charlotte moved gracefully through the tables, taking orders and balancing trays with practiced ease. Despite the demanding pace, she found herself watching the diners with quiet curiosity. There were couples leaning in close, business partners gesturing animatedly over spreadsheets, and the occasional solo diner lost in thought. Charlotte loved the stories she imagined for each of them, wondering what brought them to this elegant corner of the city. She didn't notice the woman seated near the window until she felt a faint chill of recognition. Charlotte's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long. The tailored navy suit, the perfectly coiffed blonde hair, the piercing blue eyes. The woman was striking, exuding an air of authority that made her seem almost untouchable. But there was something in her expression that caught Charlotte off guard, a flicker of hesitation, of vulnerability. It wasn't until she approached the table that she realized the woman had been watching her too. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice calm, but laced with a warmth that felt oddly familiar. "Could I get a refill of water?" "Of course," Charlotte replied, taking the glass with a polite smile. When she returned with the water, The woman's gaze lingered on her, making Charlotte shift uncomfortably. "Thank you," the woman said softly, her tone less formal this time. Charlotte nodded and moved on to the next table, her thoughts swirling. Something about the encounter had unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint why. That evening, after her shift ended, Charlotte walked home under the glow of the city lights. Her feet ached from hours on the floor, but her mind buzzed with curiosity. The woman at the restaurant had been kind, almost too kind. Charlotte was used to polite exchanges with customers, but there had been an intensity in her gaze that felt out of place. Pushing the thought aside, Charlotte focused on the sidewalk ahead. She passed a bookstore and paused, her attention caught by a display of journals in the window. On impulse, she stepped inside and purchased a small leather-bound notebook. When she returned home, Charlotte sat at her desk and opened the journal to its first blank page. She wrote, "Today, a stranger looked at me like I was important, like they saw something in me I don't even see in myself. I don't know why, but it felt different." She closed the journal and set it aside, her thoughts drifting to the woman once again. Who was she? And why did it feel like their paths crossing was more than just coincidence? As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that her life was on the verge of changing. She just didn't know how much. Madeline Harper sat in the back seat of her sleek black town car, the soft hum of the engine accompanying her thoughts. The city blurred past her window, its vibrant streets alive with energy. But for Madeline, the bustling life outside was just background noise. Her focus was entirely on the file in her lap, a manila folder containing the first results of the investigation into Charlotte Walker. She opened the folder with a deliberate calm, though her hands trembled slightly. Inside were a few photographs of Charlotte, one of her smiling as she carried a tray at Bellisario, another of her walking down a tree-lined street, and a close-up of her sitting in a park, lost in thought. Beneath the photos was a report, neatly typed and concise. Madeline read each word carefully, her breath catching as familiar details emerged. Charlotte Walker, 25 years old, grew up in St. Miriam's orphanage, attended public school, and had been working since she was 16 to support herself. No known family. St. Miriam's. The name alone sent a shiver down Madeline's spine. She could still picture the wrought iron gates of the orphanage, the ivy-covered walls, and the stern expression of the matron who had taken her daughter that fateful day. She closed the folder and exhaled deeply, her chest tight with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "Ma'am?" her driver asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "We're almost at the office. Should I take the usual route?" "Yes, James," Madeline replied absently, folding the file and placing it back in her designer handbag. Later that day, Madeline found herself pacing the expansive office of Harper Enterprises. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Manhattan, but her thoughts were miles away. Her assistant, Robert, knocked softly on the open door before stepping inside. "You wanted to see me, ma'am?" "Yes," Madeline said, her tone brisk. "I need you to arrange a meeting with Mr. Stein." "Immediately." Robert hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "The private investigator?" "Precisely." Robert nodded and left without another word, though his curiosity was evident. Madeline's sudden interest in a random waitress was unlike her. A few hours later, Madeline sat across from Mr. Stein in the privacy of her office. He was a seasoned investigator, his sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor making it clear why he was considered the best. "I need you to dig deeper," Madeline said, sliding the folder toward him. "I need to know everything about Charlotte Walker, where she's been, who she's associated with, every detail you can uncover." Mr. Stein raised an eyebrow. "This is a lot of effort for a waitress. May I ask why she's so important?" Madeline's expression hardened. "No, you may not. Just do the job." Stein nodded, pocketing the folder. "Understood. I'll contact you when I have something substantial." As the days passed, Madeline couldn't keep herself from returning to Bellisario. She made excuses to Robert about needing a quiet space to think, but the truth was simpler. She wanted to see Charlotte again. Each visit brought new observations. Madeline watched how Charlotte interacted with customers, her easy smile and warm demeanor winning over even the most difficult patrons. There was a resilience about her, a quiet strength that reminded Madeline of herself. long before the weight of her father's expectations had crushed her spirit. One evening, as Madeline lingered over her coffee, Charlotte approached with a curious look. "You've been coming in a lot lately," she said, her voice light and teasing. "Are we your new favorite spot?" Madeline smiled, though her heart raced. "Perhaps the service is exceptional." Charlotte laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "Well, I'm glad to hear that. Let me know if there's anything else I can do for you." As Charlotte walked away, Madeline felt a pang of longing. The brief exchange only deepened her conviction. She needed to know the truth. The breakthrough came a week later. Mr. Stein called her late in the evening, his voice steady but urgent. "I've found something you'll want to see," he said. "Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" Madeline agreed, though the hours until their meeting felt agonizingly slow. When they finally sat down in her office, Mr. Stein placed a stack of documents on the table between them. "Charlotte Walker's file was straightforward at first," he began. "But when I traced her back to St. Miriam's orphanage, things got interesting." He slid a birth certificate across the table. Madeline's heart skipped a beat as she read the name, Baby Girl Harper. She was brought to the orphanage 25 years ago. No identifying information beyond the mother's last name. Harper. I cross-referenced the dates and records and, well, there's no doubt Charlotte Walker is your daughter. Madeline stared at the document, her vision blurring as emotions crashed over her. Relief, guilt, joy, and fear, all tangled together in a tidal wave that left her momentarily speechless. But before she could process it all, Mr. Stein added one final piece. "There's something else," he said carefully. Edward Harper's name appeared in the orphanage's records. He made several donations over the years and seemed to have a vested interest in the place. Madeline's hands clenched into fists. "He knew," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "He knew all along." Stein nodded grimly. "It certainly seems that way." Madeline leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have imagined. Edward hadn't just forced her to give up her child. He had kept her daughter within reach, all while ensuring she would never know. "I'll handle it from here," she said finally, her voice steely as Steen left. Madeline sat alone, clutching the birth certificate in her hands. The truth was out, and now she had to decide what to do with it. Madeline Harper stood by the large window of her penthouse, gazing out at the city skyline, her mind a storm of emotions. The birth certificate and Mr. Stein's revelations lay on the glass coffee table behind her, but the weight of what they represented pressed heavily on her chest. For years, she had lived with the ache of loss, convincing herself that it was better this way, better for the child she'd been forced to give up. But now, knowing that Charlotte was her daughter, she couldn't reconcile the idea of keeping her distance. Madeline picked up the birth certificate, her fingers tracing the faint ink. "Charlotte Walker, my daughter." The words felt surreal, as if her life had taken a turn into a story she hadn't written. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Robert. "Mrs. Harper, you have a meeting in 20 minutes. Shall I send a car to pick you up?" Madeline hesitated, her usual decisiveness faltering. "Cancel it," she said finally. There was a pause on the other end. "Cancel, ma'am." "Yes, Robert. Reschedule it for later. Something urgent has come up." By the afternoon, Madeline found herself once again at Bellisario. This time, she chose a quiet table in the corner, away from her usual spot by the window. She didn't want to be seen, not until she figured out what to say to Charlotte. She watched as her daughter moved between tables, her interactions warm and effortless. Charlotte had an air of quiet resilience, a strength that Madeline recognized but couldn't take credit for. When Charlotte approached her table, Madeline straightened, her hands clasping tightly on her lap. "Back again," Charlotte said with a playful smile. "You're becoming one of our regulars." Madeline forced a chuckle, though her voice felt strained. "I suppose I am. You make it hard to stay away." Charlotte laughed lightly, her head tilting slightly in curiosity. "Well, let me know if there's anything special I can get you today." Madeline hesitated, her heart racing. "Actually, I'd love to hear your story, Charlotte. You seem so driven. What inspired you?" Charlotte blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. Most customers didn't ask much about her life, and certainly not with the intensity she saw in Madeline's eyes. "Oh," Charlotte said, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "I guess I've always been a dreamer, growing up in an orphanage. You learn to make your own way. I've worked hard to put myself through school. Someday I want to open my own cafe." "A cafe?" Madeline asked, her voice softening. "Yeah," Charlotte said, her smile growing wistful. "Nothing fancy. Just a place where people can feel at home. Good coffee, homemade pastries, maybe even a little book corner. It's been my dream for as long as I can remember." Madeline's throat tightened. Here was her daughter, standing before her, filled with ambition and warmth, yet completely unaware of the connection they shared. "That sounds wonderful," Madeline said, her voice thick with emotion. Charlotte smiled, brushing off the attention. "Well, I should get back to work, but if you ever need recommendations, let me know. I have opinions on just about every dessert on the menu." With a playful wink, she moved on to another table, leaving Madeline to sit in silence. Later that evening, back in her penthouse, Madeline stared at the ceiling, her thoughts in turmoil. She couldn't keep circling around Charlotte. Pretending to be a stranger, the truth was bound to come out eventually, and when it did, Madeline wanted it to come from her, not from someone else. But how could she tell Charlotte? How could she explain why she had abandoned her? Madeline sat up, her mind drifting to Edward. He had orchestrated this pain, separating her from her child and keeping Charlotte hidden all these years. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, threatening to consume her. She picked up the phone and dialed her father's number. It rang twice before his deep, authoritative voice answered. "Madeline," he said, his tone sharp. "This is a surprise. What do you need? Did you know where she was?" Madeline demanded, her voice trembling with anger. There was a long pause. "I don't know what you're talking about," Edward replied, though there was an edge of caution in his voice. "Don't lie to me," Madeline snapped. "Charlotte, you've known all along." Edward sighed heavily. "Madeline, I did what was necessary to protect this family. You weren't ready to raise a child, especially with that boy. Keeping her away from you was the right decision." "The right decision," Madeline said, her voice rising. "You had no right to make that choice for me. You've robbed me of my daughter's life, her childhood. And for what? To keep up appearances. I ensured she was cared for," Edward said, his tone cold and dismissive. "You should be grateful." "Grateful?" Madeline's voice cracked with disbelief. "You kept her within reach and made sure I'd never know. You didn't protect her. You controlled her. Just like you've controlled me." Edward's silence spoke volumes. "This isn't over," Madeline said, her voice firm. "You won't get away with this." She hung up, her hands shaking. For years, she had allowed Edward to dictate her life, but not anymore. Now it was her turn to take control. The following morning, Madeline awoke to the faint glow of dawn creeping through her penthouse windows. The confrontation with Edward had left her restless, but instead of exhaustion, she felt an unusual sense of clarity. The time for hesitation had passed. She had to act, but carefully. After preparing for the day, she made her way to Bellisario once more. This time, she carried a purpose far beyond observation. She needed to connect with Charlotte on a deeper level, to find a way into her life without overwhelming her. Charlotte was midway through her shift. The restaurant bustling with the usual lunch crowd, she moved with her characteristic grace, balancing trays and exchanging warm smiles with the patrons. When she noticed Madeline sitting in her now regular corner table, a flicker of curiosity crossed her face. "Good afternoon," Charlotte greeted as she approached. "You're becoming a permanent fixture around here," Madeline chuckled, though her nerves churned beneath her composed exterior. "I suppose I am. Your restaurant has a certain charm." "Well, I'm glad you like it," Charlotte said, setting down a glass of water. "Anything special for lunch today?" Madeline hesitated before replying. "Actually, I was hoping to ask you something." Charlotte tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Madeline folded her hands on the table, her expression softening. "Would you mind taking a short break to sit with me? I'd love to hear more about your dream of opening a cafe." Charlotte blinked, taken aback by the request. Customers rarely showed interest in her personal life, let alone invited her to sit with them, but something about Madeline's tone felt sincere. Let me check with my manager," Charlotte said, her smile uncertain. Moments later, Charlotte returned, this time sliding into the seat across from Madeline. "You've got me for 10 minutes, she said with a playful grin. Madeline's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and guilt. She couldn't help but marvel at Charlotte's openness and resilience, traits she wished she could have nurtured herself. "So," Madeline began, her voice warm, "tell me about this cafe you want to open." Charlotte's face lit up, the enthusiasm in her voice unmistakable. "It's something I've dreamed about for years. A small, cozy space where people can come together, feel at home and forget their worries for a little while. Good coffee, simple food, maybe even live music on weekends." Madeline nodded, a genuine smile forming on her lips. "That sounds wonderful. Have you started planning?" Charlotte laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Planning? I can barely keep up with tuition and rent, let alone save for something like that. It's a dream, not exactly a plan. Not yet, anyway." Madeline leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Dreams often start small, but they can grow into something extraordinary. Don't give up on it." Charlotte's expression softened, her usual guardedness momentarily fading. "Thank you. That means a lot." For a brief moment, they sat in silence, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background. Madeline felt a flicker of connection, a fragile thread that she hoped would grow stronger. Charlotte glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. "Looks like my break's over. Thanks for letting me ramble about my dream. Thank you for sharing it with me," Madeline replied sincerely as Charlotte stood. Madeline hesitated, then added, "If you ever need help or advice, I'd be happy to offer it." Charlotte paused, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "I'll keep that in mind. Have a great lunch." As Charlotte walked away, Madeline felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, Charlotte sat at her desk, the leather journal she had recently purchased open in front of her. "Today was strange," she wrote. "That woman, Miss Harper, she's been coming to the restaurant so often lately, and today she asked about my dream. No one ever really asks about me like that. It was nice, but also unexpected. Why does she care?" She tapped the pen against the journal, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Despite her initial skepticism, Charlotte couldn't deny that there was something comforting about Madeline's presence. Meanwhile, back at her penthouse, Madeline sat in her study. Staring at the photograph of her younger self and Michael, she traced the edges of the frame, her thoughts drifting to what could have been. The warmth she felt during her conversation with Charlotte lingered, but it was accompanied by a gnawing fear when Charlotte discovered the truth, and Madeline knew it was a matter of when. Not if. Would she feel betrayed? The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her from her thoughts. "Ms. Harper," Robert's voice came through. "Mr. Stein has an update on the investigation. Should I arrange a meeting?" Madeline's heart sank. The investigation had been necessary, but it also felt like an intrusion into Charlotte's life. Still, she couldn't ignore it. "Yes," she said firmly. "Tell him to meet me tomorrow." As she ended the call, Madeline leaned back in her chair, her resolve strengthening. She had begun to build a fragile connection with Charlotte, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The sound of Madeline's heels echoed against the marble floor as she entered the private meeting room at Harper Enterprises. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, but the brightness did little to lift the weight pressing on her chest. Sitting at the head of the table was Mr. Stein, his expression as unreadable as ever, a thick folder resting in front of him. "Good morning, Miss Harper," he greeted, standing briefly as she approached. "Good morning," Madeline replied, her tone clipped. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, folding her hands on the table. "What did you find?" Stein slid the folder across the table. "I've gathered additional information on Charlotte Walker. I believe some of it will confirm your suspicions, but other details may complicate things further." Madeline's fingers hovered over the folder for a moment before she opened it. Inside were new documents, school records, employment history, and even medical files. But what caught her eye were a series of receipts and financial records. "These payments," Madeline said slowly, flipping through the pages. "They're from Edward Harper," Stein confirmed. "He made consistent donations to St. Miriam's orphanage for over 20 years. Most were registered as charitable contributions, but I also found smaller, direct payments that were quietly marked as support funds." Madeline's jaw clenched. "He's been controlling her life all this time. Even after he forced me to give her up, he kept her under his thumb. Stein hesitated before adding, "It seems likely that he kept tabs on her whereabouts. It wouldn't be difficult for someone with his resources." Madeline leaned back in her chair, her hands tightening into fists. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. Edward hadn't just stolen her daughter. He had manipulated every facet of Charlotte's life from the shadows, ensuring that neither of them could find each other. "Did he ever meet her?" she asked, her voice strained. "There's no direct evidence of that," Stein said. "But the level of involvement suggests he wanted to stay informed." Madeline's heart ached at the thought of her father's influence lingering over Charlotte's life. She closed the folder with a sharp snap, her decision already forming. "Thank you, Mr. Stein," she said, standing abruptly. "Your services are no longer required." "I'll handle it from here," Stein nodded, rising to leave. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me." That evening, Madeline sat in her study, a glass of wine untouched on the desk in front of her. The revelations about Edward had reignited her anger, but they had also solidified her resolve. She had let him dictate too much of her life, and she wasn't about to let him control Charlotte's any longer. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was Robert. "Ms. Harper, your father has requested a meeting," he said, his voice hesitant. Madeline's lips pressed into a thin line. "Tell him I'll meet him at his residence tomorrow morning." "Understood." As she hung up, Madeline felt a wave of apprehension. Confronting Edward was a risk, but she knew it was one she had to take. The next morning, Madeline arrived at her father's grand estate. The sprawling mansion, with its towering columns and manicured gardens, was a stark reminder of the world Edward Harper had built, a world of control, power, and calculated moves. She was greeted by the butler and led to Edward's private study. The room was as imposing as the man himself, with dark wood paneling and shelves lined with leather-bound books. Edward sat behind his massive desk, his sharp eyes narrowing as Madeline entered. "Madeline," he said, his tone curt. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Madeline didn't bother sitting. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "You've been lying to me for 25 years. Edward raised an eyebrow, his expression cool. "I assume you're referring to Charlotte." "You knew," Madeline spat, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You knew exactly where she was, and you kept her from me. You manipulated her life, just like you've manipulated mine." Edward sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I did what I had to do to protect this family. You were too young, too naive. That child would have been a liability." "A liability," Madeline repeated, her voice rising. "She's my daughter. You had no right to take her from me. No right to control her life like she was one of your business deals." Edward's gaze hardened. "I saved you from ruining everything, and look at what you've become because of it. A successful, powerful woman. You wouldn't be here if you had been tied down with a child and a penniless farm boy." Madeline's hands clenched at her sides. "Don't you dare diminish what Michael and I had, and don't pretend that your actions were for my benefit. This was never about me. It was about your ego and your empire." Edward stood, his imposing figure looming over the desk. "I won't apologize for doing what was necessary. You're here today because of the decisions I made." Madeline took a step closer, her voice low and steady. "No, I'm here despite you, and I won't let you control her life any longer. Charlotte is off limits." Edward smirked, a cold, calculated expression. "And what will you do, Madeline? Tell her the truth. Do you really think she'll forgive you for abandoning her?" Madeline's breath caught, but she steadied herself. "She might not forgive me, but at least I'll have done the right thing. Something you wouldn't understand." With that, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She felt his gaze burning into her back, but she didn't falter as the door closed behind her. Madeline exhaled, her chest heaving with a mix of anger and relief. For the first time, she had stood up to Edward Harper, not just for herself, but for Charlotte. This was only the beginning. The weight of the confrontation with Edward lingered as Madeline returned to her penthouse. She had faced her father before, but this time felt different. It wasn't just about asserting her independence. It was about protecting Charlotte, the daughter she had already lost too much time with. Madeline sat at her desk, staring at the small stack of documents Stein had given her. The birth certificate lay on top, a symbol of everything she had been robbed of. But behind the anger and determination was a gnawing fear. Would Charlotte even want to know the truth? Meanwhile, at Bellisario, Charlotte was finishing up another busy shift. The restaurant was quieter than usual, the lull giving her a rare moment to reflect. She found herself thinking about Madeline Harper, the elegant woman who had become an unexpected fixture in her life over the past few weeks. There was something about her that intrigued Charlotte, an intensity in her gaze, a warmth beneath the polished surface. It felt personal, like Madeline saw her as more than just a waitress. As Charlotte gathered her belongings in the staff room, Julia, one of her co-workers, leaned against a locker with a knowing smirk. "Your regular was in again today," Julia teased. Charlotte rolled her eyes. "She's just a customer." "Uh-huh," Julia said, folding her arms. "A customer who asks about your life and looks at you like she's about to adopt you or something," Charlotte laughed. Though the comment struck a chord. "She's probably just lonely. Rich people get weird like that." Julia shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe there's more to it." Charlotte waved her off with a smile. But as she walked home that evening, the conversation stayed with her. The next day, Madeline sat in her car outside Bellisario, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her resolve was beginning to waver. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say to Charlotte, but now that the moment was here, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. What if Charlotte rejected her? What if the truth only drove her further away? Taking a deep breath, Madeline stepped out of the car. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with its usual energy. Charlotte was behind the counter, chatting with a co-worker as she organized plates. Madeline hesitated, then approached. "Charlotte?" Charlotte turned, surprised to see her outside her usual table. "Oh, hi, you're early today." Madeline managed a small smile. "I was hoping we could talk, privately." Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. Sure. Let me check with my manager." A few minutes later, they were seated in a quiet corner of the restaurant. Charlotte studied Madeline curiously, sensing a seriousness in her expression that wasn't there before. "What's going on?" Charlotte asked, folding her hands on the table. Madeline hesitated, her throat tightening. She had faced boardrooms full of cutthroat executives, negotiated billion-dollar deals, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice softer than usual. "Something important about your past." Charlotte frowned, her curiosity shifting to unease. "My past?" Madeline nodded. "I know you grew up in St. Miriam's orphanage. I know you don't have much information about your family." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly. "How do you know that?" Madeline took a deep breath, deciding there was no turning back. "Because I was there the day you were taken to St. Miriam's. I'm the one who..." Her voice faltered. "I'm your mother, Charlotte." For a moment, there was only silence. Charlotte stared at Madeline, her expression frozen in disbelief. "What?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm your mother," Madeline repeated, her eyes pleading. "I didn't want to give you up, but I was forced to. My father. He made me..." "Wait. Stop," Charlotte said, holding up a hand. "This has to be some kind of joke." "It's not a joke," Madeline said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, it's the truth. I've spent years regretting what happened, and when I saw you that day at the restaurant, I knew I had to find out." Charlotte's face flushed with a mix of emotions. Shock, anger, confusion. "You're telling me you're my mother after all this time? You just show up and drop this on me?" Madeline reached across the table, but Charlotte pulled back. "I know this is overwhelming. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I couldn't keep it from you any longer. You have every right to be angry, but please let me explain." "Explain," Charlotte interrupted, her voice rising. "You abandoned me. You left me in an orphanage and went on with your life like I didn't exist. What kind of explanation makes that okay?" Tears welled in Madeline's eyes. "I didn't have a choice. My father..." "Your father," Charlotte snapped. "What about you? You could have fought for me. But you didn't. And now, after 25 years, you expect me to just... what? Be okay with this?" Madeline sat silently, her heart breaking with each word. "I need time," Charlotte said finally, standing abruptly. "I need to process this. Please don't come back here." Before Madeline could respond, Charlotte walked away, leaving her alone at the table. That night, Charlotte sat in her small apartment, staring blankly at the journal on her desk. Her emotions churned wildly. Anger, sadness, a faint glimmer of hope. Madeline's words echoed in her mind, but the wounds of abandonment were too deep to ignore. Could it really be true? Charlotte didn't have the answer, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same. The next morning, Madeline woke with a heavy heart. The previous day's confrontation with Charlotte played on a loop in her mind, each word sharper than the last. She sat at her kitchen counter. A steaming cup of coffee untouched in front of her, she had expected Charlotte to be angry. How could she not be? But the raw pain in her daughter's voice had been more than Madeline could bear. It was a stark reminder of the years she had lost, the damage she had allowed to happen for the first time in years. Madeline felt powerless. No amount of wealth, influence, or carefully calculated strategy could undo the past or force forgiveness. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her thoughts. She hesitated before glancing at the screen. It was Robert. "Mrs. Harper," he began cautiously. "Your father has requested another meeting." Madeline's grip on the phone tightened. "Tell him I'm not available." Robert's voice lowered. "He was quite insistent, ma'am. He said it concerns the company." Madeline closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Edward's interference was the last thing she needed, but ignoring him wouldn't make him go away. "I'll meet him this afternoon," she said finally, ending the call. Across town, Charlotte sat at a small cafe near her apartment, staring into her cup of tea. The usually comforting smell of cinnamon and fresh pastries felt suffocating today. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Madeline Harper, my mother. The words felt foreign and unreal, like they belonged to someone else's story. She flipped through the pages of her journal, stopping at the entry from a few days ago. Today, a stranger looked at me like I was important. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Madeline's sudden interest in her life wasn't a coincidence. It was guilt. Guilt for leaving her behind. For pretending she didn't exist. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Charlotte looked up to see Julia walking in. Her coworker spotted her immediately and slid into the seat across from her. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Julia said, eyeing her friend carefully. Charlotte hesitated, unsure of how to explain. Finally, she blurted, "That regular at the restaurant. She says she's my mother." Julia's eyes widened. "Wait, what? Your mother, the rich lady?" Charlotte nodded, her grip tightening on her mug. "And is it true?" Julia asked. "I don't know," Charlotte admitted, her voice trembling. "She says she had to give me up, but I don't know what to believe. Why would she wait 25 years to find me? Why now?" Julia reached across the table, squeezing Charlotte's hand. "That's heavy, Char. Have you thought about hearing her out?" Charlotte shook her head. "I don't know if I can. She abandoned me. She doesn't get to just waltz back into my life and expect everything to be okay." Julia frowned. "Maybe, but if she's telling the truth, don't you want answers?" Charlotte looked away, her chest tightening. She hated how torn she felt, how a part of her wanted to push Madeline away while another part yearned to understand. That afternoon, Madeline arrived at Edward Harper's estate. The grand mansion loomed before her, as cold and imposing as the man inside. Edward greeted her in his study, his demeanor as calm and controlled as ever. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Madeline ignored the invitation, crossing her arms. "What do you want?" Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her with a faint smirk. "I understand you've been meddling in the girl's life." "Her name is Charlotte," Madeline snapped. "And yes, I've been speaking with her. Not that it's any of your concern." Edward's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. That girl has no place in your life. She's a distraction, nothing more." Madeline's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to dictate what I do anymore. I've spent my entire life under your thumb, and I won't let you destroy this too." Edward rose from his chair, his voice cold. "I made you who you are. Madeline, without me, you'd be nothing. Don't forget that." Madeline took a step closer, her voice steady. "You didn't make me. You stole from me. My choices, my happiness, my daughter. But you don't control me anymore. I won't let you manipulate Charlotte the way you've manipulated me." Edward's smirk returned, but there was an edge to it. You think you can fix this? She'll hate you, Madeline. You left her, you abandoned her, and when she realizes that, she'll never forgive you. Madeline's chest tightened, but she refused to show weakness. Maybe she won't, but at least I'll have tried. That's more than you can say, without waiting for a response. She turned and left, the sound of her heels echoing through the silent hallway. That evening, Madeline sat in her study, staring at the phone. She had been tempted to call Charlotte all day, but each time, fear stopped her. Finally, she dialed. The phone rang twice before Charlotte's voice answered, cautious and distant. "Hello, it's me," Madeline said softly. "I know you asked me to stay away, but I need you to know something." There was a long pause before Charlotte replied, "What is it?" Madeline's voice trembled as she spoke. "I never wanted to give you up. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I know that doesn't change what happened, but I need you to understand. I didn't abandon you because I didn't love you. I did it because I thought it was the only way to protect you." Charlotte didn't respond, but Madeline could hear her faint breathing on the other end. "I'll give you all the time and space you need," Madeline continued, "but I'll be here whenever you're ready." With that, she ended the call, leaving Charlotte alone with her thoughts. And the truth. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, her phone still in her hand, Madeline's words replaying in her mind. "I didn't abandon you because I didn't love you." The weight of the sentence settled heavily in her chest, making it hard to breathe. How was she supposed to process something like this? Her entire life had been built on the belief that she was unwanted, that her mother had left her without a second thought. And now, the woman who claimed to be her mother had upended that narrative with a single phone call. She set the phone down and buried her face in her hands, trying to quiet the storm raging in her head. The next day at work, Charlotte moved through her shift with a distracted air. Her usual energy and warmth were replaced with a quiet detachment that didn't go unnoticed by her coworkers. "Hey, you okay?" Julia asked during a brief lull in the rush. Charlotte forced a smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Julia raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "Well, if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. Always." "Thanks," Charlotte said softly. As the lunch crowd began to thin, Charlotte found herself glancing toward the door every time the bell jingled, half expecting to see Madeline walk in. But the hours passed, and Madeline didn't appear. Charlotte wasn't sure if she felt relieved or disappointed. Meanwhile, Madeline sat in her penthouse, staring out at the city skyline. She hadn't slept much the night before, her mind consumed with thoughts of Charlotte. The silence after her phone call had been deafening, and she couldn't stop second-guessing herself. She had told Charlotte the truth, but was it enough? Could it ever be enough? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, turning to see Robert entering with his usual composed demeanor. "Ms. Harper, I've rescheduled your meeting with the board," he said, placing a folder on her desk. "And there's also a message from your father's office. He's requesting another meeting." Madeline's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested." "Understood," Robert said, though his hesitation didn't go unnoticed. "Is there something else?" she asked. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "If I may speak freely, ma'am, you've been different lately, distracted. The team is beginning to notice." Madeline sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's personal, Robert, but I'll handle it." He nodded, though the concern in his eyes lingered. That evening, Charlotte sat in her apartment, flipping through an old photo album she had brought with her when she left the orphanage. Most of the pictures were of the other children and the staff, but there were a few of herself as a child, her wide smile and bright eyes masking the loneliness she had always felt. Her gaze lingered on a photo of herself at 8 years old, standing outside St. Miriam's with a bouquet of flowers in her hand. The memory came rushing back. She had won a small spelling competition at school, and the flowers were her prize. She remembered wishing, as she clutched the bouquet, that someone would come to celebrate with her. A parent, an aunt, anyone. But no one had come now. The woman claiming to be her mother was asking for a chance to explain, to make things right. Why should I let her? Charlotte thought bitterly. She had spent years learning how to rely on herself, to build a life without a family. Letting Madeline in felt like opening a wound that had barely healed. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Julia. Julia, drinks after work tomorrow. You need a break. Charlotte hesitated before typing back. Sure, why not? The following evening, Julia and Charlotte found themselves at a cozy bar a few blocks from Bellisario. The warm lighting and soft music created an inviting atmosphere, but Charlotte's mind remained elsewhere. You've been quiet all night, Julia said, taking a sip of her cocktail. What's going on? Charlotte toyed with the edge of her glass. It's about my mother, or the woman who says she's my mother. Julia's eyebrows shot up. She's still in touch. She called me last night, Charlotte admitted. She said she didn't have a choice, that she was forced to give me up to protect me. And do you believe her? Julia asked. I don't know, Charlotte said, her voice cracking. I want to, but how do you forgive someone for leaving you? Julia leaned forward, her expression serious. Charlotte, I can't pretend to know what that's like, but maybe this isn't about forgiveness, at least not yet. Maybe it's just about understanding. Charlotte stared at her drink, Julia's words sinking in. Understanding. Could she bring herself to even listen? Madeline sat in her study that same night, staring at the phone on her desk. She wanted to call Charlotte again, to check on her, but she knew she needed to give her space. Pushing too hard would only make things worse. Instead, she turned her attention to the files Stein had given her, searching for anything she could use to connect with Charlotte. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes landed on a small detail she hadn't noticed before. A scholarship application Charlotte had submitted to a local business foundation. Madeline's heart ached as she read the essay Charlotte had written. In it, Charlotte described her dream of opening a cafe, a place where people could feel at home no matter where they came from. Driven, resourceful, compassionate, Madeline murmured to herself. That's my daughter. For the first time in weeks, a faint smile crossed her lips. She didn't know how to fix the damage of the past, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't give up on Charlotte. The city skyline twinkled against the darkening sky as Charlotte sat in her apartment, the weight of unanswered questions pressing heavily on her chest. Madeline's words from the phone call echoed in her mind. I did it to protect you. She wanted to dismiss them, to label them as empty excuses, but a small, stubborn part of her couldn't let it go. What if she's telling the truth? She stared at the photo on her desk, her 8-year-old self clutching that bouquet of flowers. The loneliness she'd felt that day was the same ache she felt now, though it had taken a different shape. Charlotte opened her journal and wrote, If I let her in, will I just be opening myself up to more pain? The next day, Charlotte decided to take her mind off things by arriving early for her shift at Bellisario. She hoped the busyness of the restaurant would drown out her thoughts. Morning, early bird, Julia greeted her with a smile as Charlotte tied her apron. I couldn't sleep, Charlotte admitted, forcing a small laugh. Julia studied her for a moment before changing the subject. Table setup's almost done, but we've got a private event later. Should be a busy one. Good, Charlotte said. I need the distraction. Madeline Harper sat in her office at Harper Enterprises, poring over documents that demanded her attention but couldn't hold it. Every number, every paragraph blurred into meaningless text as her thoughts circled back to Charlotte. The faint buzz of her intercom interrupted her. Robert's voice came through. Ms. Harper, there's a call for you on line 2. It's from the manager at Bellisario. Madeline frowned, her heart skipping a beat. Put it through. The manager's voice was polite but firm. Ms. Harper, I'm calling to inform you that one of our employees, Charlotte Walker, has requested that you not be seated in her section during your visits. She's expressed discomfort with your presence. Madeline's stomach sank. I see, she said, her voice barely steady. Thank you for letting me know. As the call ended, Madeline sat back in her chair, the rejection cutting deeper than she had anticipated. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over Charlotte's number before setting it back down. She couldn't force a connection, no matter how badly she wanted one. That evening, Charlotte walked home under the glow of streetlights, the crisp air biting at her cheeks. The manager's decision to call Madeline on her behalf had been a relief, but it didn't erase the lingering guilt she felt. She replayed her conversation with Julia the previous night. Maybe it's not about forgiveness. Maybe it's about understanding. Charlotte sighed, pulling her coat tighter around her. The idea of meeting with Madeline again felt daunting, but ignoring her didn't feel right either. When she reached her apartment, she found a small envelope taped to her door. Her name was written in elegant script. Inside was a handwritten note. "Charlotte, I know I've asked for your forgiveness, but I also understand if you're not ready to give it. If nothing else, I want to help you achieve the dreams you've worked so hard for. Please let me know if there's a way I can support you." It wasn't signed, but Charlotte didn't need to guess who it was from. The following week, Madeline attended a charity gala at the insistence of Robert and her public relations team. The glittering ballroom was filled with New York's elite, the hum of conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses echoing in the grand space. Madeline moved through the crowd with practiced grace, exchanging polite smiles and firm handshakes, but her heart wasn't in it. She excused herself from a conversation and stepped onto the terrace, the cool night air a welcome reprieve from the stifling atmosphere inside. She leaned against the railing. Gazing at the city below, her mind wandered to Charlotte, wondering if she had read the note. Mrs. Harper. Madeline turned to see an older man approach, a glass of scotch in his hand. His sharp suit and confident demeanor marked him as one of the city's influential players. "Mr. Phillips," she greeted with a polite nod. "I heard about your recent personal endeavors," he said, his tone laced with curiosity. Madeline stiffened. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. Word travels quickly in our circles," Phillips said with a smirk. "Something about a connection to a certain waitress at Bellisario." Madeline's eyes narrowed. "My personal life is not up for discussion," Phillips chuckled. Of course. Just thought it was interesting. You've always been one to keep things so tightly controlled." Madeline turned back to the cityscape, her jaw clenched. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Phillips." As Phillips walked away, Madeline's resolve hardened. If whispers about Charlotte were already spreading, she needed to protect her from the scrutiny of the world Madeline inhabited, a world that could be as ruthless as her father. Charlotte stared at the note on her kitchen counter, reading it for what felt like the 100th time. Part of her wanted to crumple it and throw it away, but another part of her couldn't. Finally, she picked up her phone and dialed the number scribbled at the bottom. Madeline answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant. "Charlotte, let's meet," Charlotte said, her tone guarded. "But not at the restaurant. Somewhere neutral." Madeline exhaled, relief washing over her. "Of course, just tell me when and where." Charlotte hesitated before replying. "Tomorrow afternoon there's a park near 8th Avenue. I'll text you the exact spot." "I'll be there," Madeline said softly, as the call ended. Charlotte set the phone down, her emotions a tangled mess. She didn't know what she would say or how she would feel, but she couldn't ignore the note, or the woman who had left it. The winter sun was pale but persistent as it hung over the park near 8th Avenue. Charlotte arrived early, the quiet rustling of leaves and the sound of distant traffic providing a soothing backdrop. She clutched a thermos of tea in her hands, the warmth grounding her as she waited. Her thoughts were a storm of questions, doubts, and guarded hope. What did she really want from this meeting? Answers. Closure. Could she even begin to understand Madeline Harper, let alone forgive her? A flash of navy blue caught her attention. Madeline approached from the other side of the park, her tailored coat and scarf cutting a sharp figure against the muted tones of the landscape. She walked with her usual grace, but there was a vulnerability in her posture, a hesitance that Charlotte hadn't seen before. "Charlotte," Madeline greeted softly, stopping a few feet away. "Hi," Charlotte replied, her voice guarded. Madeline hesitated before gesturing to a nearby bench. "Shall we sit?" Charlotte nodded, and they settled onto the bench, the space between them heavy with unspoken words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Madeline stared at the frost-covered grass, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Charlotte sipped her tea, waiting for her to start. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Madeline said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte shrugged. "You left a note. It seemed important." Madeline looked at her, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "It is important. You're important, Charlotte. I know I've hurt you, and I know there's nothing I can say to erase what I did, but I need you to know that I've never stopped thinking about you. Never stopped caring." Charlotte's throat tightened. "You cared. Then why did you leave me?" Madeline inhaled deeply, her breath visible in the cold air. "It wasn't my choice. My father, your grandfather, forced me to give you up. He threatened Michael, your father, and made it clear that if I didn't comply, he would destroy us both. Charlotte's brow furrowed. Michael, my father, what happened to him? Madeline's expression softened. He wanted to stay, to fight for us, but my father sent him away. I don't even know where he is now. The mention of her father stirred something new in Charlotte, a longing she hadn't realized was there. So, you just let him win? Charlotte asked, her tone sharp. I was young, Madeline admitted, her voice cracking. I was scared, and I thought I was doing what was best for you. I thought if I let you go, you'd have a chance at a better life. Charlotte looked away, her chest tightening with conflicting emotions. Madeline reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather journal, its edges worn with time. I brought this for you, she said, holding it out. It's something I kept after I lost you. I wrote to you, even though I knew you'd never read it. Charlotte hesitated before taking the journal. She opened it to the first page, her mother's elegant handwriting filling the lines. To my dearest Charlotte, I'm writing this because I don't know how else to hold on to you. Every day, I think of your tiny hands and your sweet face. I wonder if you're happy, if you're safe. I wonder if you'll ever forgive me. Charlotte's hands trembled as she flipped through more pages, each one filled with letters spanning years. You wrote all this? She asked, her voice barely audible. Madeline nodded. I had to. It was the only way I could feel close to you. Charlotte closed the journal and clutched it to her chest, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past hanging between them. Finally, Charlotte broke the silence. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said, her voice raw. But I want to understand. Madeline's eyes filled with tears. That's all I could ask for. Charlotte took a deep breath, steadying herself. You said you wanted to help me, why? Madeline smiled faintly. Because I see how hard you've worked, how much you've achieved on your own. You've built a life without me, and that's something I admire deeply. But if there's anything I can do to support you, I want to. Not to erase the past, but to show you that I'm here now. Charlotte studied her mother's face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was raw emotion, a mixture of love, regret, and hope. I don't need your money, Charlotte said firmly. I know, Madeline replied, but maybe I can help you in other ways. I could introduce you to people who can support your dream, mentor you, if you'd let me. Charlotte considered this, her walls softening slightly. I'll think about it. Madeline nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. As the sun began to set, casting the park in hues of gold and pink, Charlotte rose from the bench. I should go, she said, tucking the journal into her bag. Madeline stood as well. Thank you, Charlotte, for giving me this chance. Charlotte offered a small nod before walking away, leaving Madeline standing alone in the growing twilight. Madeline watched her daughter disappear into the distance, her heart heavy yet hopeful. For the first time in years, she felt like she had taken a step toward healing the wound that had haunted her for so long. The days following their meeting in the park left both Madeline and Charlotte navigating unfamiliar terrain. Charlotte carried the leather journal in her bag everywhere she went, though she hadn't dared to read more than a few pages. Each word felt like a thread pulling her closer to Madeline, but the wounds of abandonment were not so easily healed. Madeline, on the other hand, threw herself into action. She contacted her network, discreetly seeking ways to support Charlotte's dream without overwhelming her. But beneath the hope of building a connection with her daughter was an undercurrent of unease. Edward Harper wouldn't let this newfound bond flourish without a fight. One crisp afternoon, Charlotte was walking home from a study session at the local library. The streets were alive with the sounds of honking cars and hurried footsteps, but she felt oddly detached from the bustle around her. Her mind kept drifting back to her conversation with Madeline. She turned a corner and froze. A sleek black car was parked across the street, and leaning against it was a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit. He watched her with a cold intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "Charlotte Walker?" he asked, stepping forward. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "Who's asking?" "I work for Edward Harper," the man said, his voice smooth, but laced with menace. "He'd like to speak with you." Charlotte's heart raced. Edward Harper, the man Madeline had described as the force behind her abandonment. "I don't think so," Charlotte said, turning on her heel. The man moved to block her path. "Ms. Walker, I suggest you reconsider. Mr. Harper is not someone you want to ignore." Charlotte squared her shoulders, masking her fear. "I'm not interested in anything he has to say." The man studied her for a moment before stepping back. "Very well, but I'd think carefully before dismissing his generosity. He can be a powerful ally, or a dangerous enemy." Charlotte didn't respond. She walked away quickly, her heart pounding as she turned the corner and disappeared into the crowd. That evening, Madeline sat at her desk, reviewing a list of potential business contacts she could introduce to Charlotte. Her phone buzzed, and when she saw Charlotte's name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. "Charlotte," she answered quickly. "There was a man," Charlotte said, her voice sharp and slightly panicked. "He said he works for Edward Harper. He stopped me on the street." Madeline's stomach dropped. "What did he say?" "He wanted me to meet with Edward when I said no. He made it sound like a threat." Madeline's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you safe?" "I'm fine," Charlotte replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "But what is he trying to do?" Madeline's voice softened, but anger burned beneath her calm tone. "My father. He doesn't like losing control. He knows about us, Charlotte, and he's trying to intimidate you. But you don't have to face him alone." Charlotte hesitated. "I don't want to be dragged into whatever games he's playing. I just want my life back." Madeline felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry you're caught in this. I'll handle him. I promise." "Good," Charlotte said firmly, "because I won't be bullied by him. Or you." The call ended abruptly, leaving Madeline staring at her phone, a mix of determination and dread settling over her. The following day, Madeline strode into Edward Harper's estate, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. She didn't wait for the butler to announce her, pushing open the doors to her father's study with a force that startled him. "Madeline," Edward said, looking up from his desk with a faint smirk. "To what do I owe this dramatic entrance?" She stepped forward, her gaze icy. "Stay away from Charlotte." Edward leaned back in his chair, unbothered by her tone. "I merely wanted to speak with her. I thought she deserved to hear both sides of the story." "Don't insult my intelligence," Madeline snapped. "You sent one of your goons to intimidate her. She doesn't need your version of the truth." Edward's smirk faded, his expression hardening. "You've become quite bold, Madeline. But let me remind you who built the life you so comfortably enjoy. I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for because of some misguided attempt to fix the past." Madeline's fists clenched at her sides. "Destroy what? Your carefully crafted empire of control and manipulation. Charlotte doesn't want anything from you, and neither do I." Edward rose from his chair, his towering presence filling the room. "You're playing a dangerous game, Madeline. That girl is a liability, and you're too blinded by guilt to see it." "She's my daughter," Madeline said, her voice steady, "and I will do whatever it takes to protect her from you." Edward's eyes narrowed, a silent threat lingering in the air. "You always were a fool for sentiment." Madeline turned on her heel and left the room without another word, her heart pounding as she walked away. She had faced Edward before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for Charlotte. Charlotte spent the evening trying to focus on her coursework, but her thoughts kept returning to the encounter with Edward's man. She didn't know much about the world of wealth and power that Madeline came from, but it was becoming clear that it was far more dangerous than she had imagined. Her phone buzzed and she saw a text from Julia. "Julia, drinks tomorrow, my treat. You could use a distraction." Charlotte smiled faintly, typing back a quick reply. "Sounds good. Thanks, Jules." She glanced at the leather journal sitting on her desk and flipped it open to a random page. Madeline's words spilled across the paper, raw and unfiltered. "I hope one day you'll understand why I did what I did, even if you never forgive me. I need you to know how much I love you." Charlotte closed the journal, her emotions a tangle of anger, sadness, and reluctant empathy. For now, she needed space, but part of her wondered how long she could keep the chaos at bay. The tension between Charlotte and Madeline lingered in the air like a storm on the horizon. Charlotte had tried to bury herself in her routine, work, school, and occasional nights out with Julia, But no amount of distraction could silence the questions swirling in her mind. The memory of Edward Harper's man on the street refused to fade. The threat had been subtle, but unmistakable, and the realization that she was caught in a power struggle far beyond her control gnawed at her. Madeline, on the other hand, had been relentless in her efforts to shield Charlotte from her father's influence. She had sent security to discreetly monitor Charlotte's neighborhood, ensuring her safety without intruding on her privacy. At the same time, she pored over legal documents, searching for any way to sever Edward's hold on the trust fund he had quietly established in Charlotte's name. But Madeline knew Edward wouldn't back down so easily. A week later, as Charlotte finished her shift at Bellisario, Julia caught her by the arm. "You're not sneaking home to study tonight," Julia said with a grin. "We're going to Murphy's for drinks. No excuses." Charlotte sighed but relented. "Fine, one drink, but you're buying." "That's the spirit," Julia said, dragging her out the door. The bar was lively. Filled with the hum of laughter and the clinking of glasses, Julia ordered cocktails for them both, her infectious energy pulling Charlotte out of her funk, at least for a little while. As Charlotte sipped her drink, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening when she saw the message. "Unknown number. We need to talk. Meet me at the park tomorrow at noon. Edward Harper." Charlotte's hands clenched around her phone, anger flaring in her chest. She showed the message to Julia, who frowned. "That guy again?" Julia asked. "What's his deal?" "He's Madeline's father," Charlotte said, her voice low. "And apparently he's decided I'm part of his business now." Julia's eyes widened. "Are you seriously going to meet him?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted. "But if I don't, he'll probably just find another way to get to me." Julia leaned closer, her tone serious. "Be careful, Char. Guys like that don't play fair." The next day, Charlotte arrived at the park just before noon, her stomach a knot of nerves. Edward Harper was already there, seated on a bench beneath a towering oak tree. He exuded an air of power and control, his tailored suit immaculate despite the casual setting. "Charlotte," he greeted, his tone polite but cold. "You wanted to talk," she said, crossing her arms. Edward gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'll get straight to the point," Edward said. "You've been drawn into something you don't understand. My daughter is emotional, impulsive. She doesn't see the bigger picture." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "And what's the bigger picture?" "Legacy," Edward said, leaning forward slightly. "The Harper name carries weight, power, influence. Your involvement jeopardizes that. Madeline's attempts to bring you into her life are reckless at best." Charlotte's hands curled into fists. "So what? You want me to disappear?" Edward's smile widened, but it was devoid of warmth. "I'm offering you an opportunity. You're young, intelligent. I can provide you with resources, connections, anything you need to succeed. But in return, I need you to step away from Madeline." Charlotte stared at him, her mind reeling. His offer was both insulting and manipulative, an attempt to buy her silence and sever her growing bond with her mother. "You think you can just pay me off?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger. Edward's expression hardened. "I think you're smart enough to understand what's at stake." Charlotte took a step closer, her voice steady despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface. "I don't need your money, and I won't let you control me, or her." For the first time, Edward's composure faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "You're making a mistake." "No," Charlotte said firmly. "You are." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding. Madeline was in her office when she received a text from Charlotte. "Charlotte, I just met with Edward. He tried to bribe me to stay away from you." Madeline's hands trembled as she read the message. She immediately dialed Charlotte's number. When Charlotte answered, her voice was calm but clipped. "I handled it. You shouldn't have gone," Madeline said, her voice thick with worry. "He's dangerous, Charlotte." "I can see that," Charlotte replied, "but he doesn't scare me. I'm not going to let him decide how I live my life." Madeline felt a surge of pride, though it was tempered by fear. "You don't have to do this alone, let me help you." Charlotte hesitated. "I'll think about it." As the call ended, Madeline stared out the window, her resolve hardening. Edward had crossed a line, and she wouldn't let him harm Charlotte. Not again. That evening, Charlotte sat at her desk, the leather journal open in front of her. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a letter Madeline had written years ago. I hope you grow up to be strong, brave, and kind. I hope you never let anyone tell you who you are or what you're worth. And I hope one day you'll know how much I love you. Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes as she closed the journal. For all her anger and hurt, she couldn't deny the sincerity in Madeline's words. Edward Harper might have tried to control her life, but Charlotte was determined to make her own choices. Starting now, Charlotte sat at her small kitchen table, the leather journal open beside her. The words Madeline had written years ago echoed in her mind, each letter pulling her closer to the woman she had spent so long resenting. For the first time, she began to see past her anger and into the raw regret woven through the pages. But even as she softened toward Madeline, her encounter with Edward lingered like a dark cloud. His thinly veiled threats and condescending demeanor had left her shaken, but also more determined than ever to assert her independence. Madeline, meanwhile, had spent the morning making phone calls and preparing for her next move. Edward's attempts to intimidate Charlotte had crossed a line, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. "Robert," she said into her office phone, her tone firm, "I want everything we have on the Harper Family Trust. Every clause, every loophole, and I need it by the end of the day." "Yes, ma'am," Robert replied, though the hesitation in his voice was evident. "Are you sure this is wise? Your father won't take this lightly." Madeline's jaw tightened. "I don't care what he takes lightly. Just get me the information," as she hung up. Madeline leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had spent her entire life navigating the cutthroat world her father had created. But this time was different. This wasn't about business or legacy. This was about protecting her daughter. That afternoon, Charlotte arrived at Bellisario for her shift. But something felt off. The usual buzz of the restaurant seemed muted, and her co-workers exchanged nervous glances as she walked in. "What's going on?" Charlotte asked Julia, who was folding napkins at the counter. Julia hesitated before replying. "There was a guy here earlier, said he was looking for you." Charlotte's stomach dropped. "What did he say?" "Nothing much," Julia said, her brow furrowed. "But he left this for you." She handed Charlotte a folded piece of paper. Charlotte unfolded it slowly, her heart racing as she read the message. "This isn't over. We'll talk again soon." The note wasn't signed, but Charlotte didn't need a signature to know who it was from. Later that evening, Charlotte sat in her apartment. The note crumpled in her hand. Her anger simmered just beneath the surface, but beneath it was a growing sense of unease. Edward Harper wasn't going to back down, and she was tired of feeling like a pawn in his game. Her phone buzzed, and she saw Madeline's name on the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but then she answered. "Charlotte," Madeline said, relief evident in her voice. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Charlotte replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "What happened?" Madeline pressed. Charlotte hesitated before telling her about the note left at the restaurant. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Madeline spoke, her tone icy with controlled fury. "He's gone too far," Charlotte sighed. "I don't know what to do, Madeline. I don't want to be part of this. Whatever this is." "You shouldn't have to be," Madeline said firmly. "This is my fight. Not yours. But I need you to trust me. Let me handle this." Charlotte's instinct was to push back, to insist that she didn't need anyone's help, but the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her. "Fine. What's your plan?" "I'm going to cut him off," Madeline said. "Legally, financially, whatever it takes to keep him from interfering in your life." Charlotte exhaled slowly. "If you can do that, then do it." The next day, Madeline met with her legal team in the boardroom of Harper Enterprises. She laid out her intentions with a clarity that left no room for argument. "I want my father removed as trustee of the Harper Family Trust," she said. "His actions have made him unfit to manage its assets." One of the attorneys, a middle-aged man with graying hair, frowned. "That won't be easy, Ms. Harper. Your father has significant influence over the board, and the trust's bylaws favor his authority." "Then find a way," Madeline replied, her voice steely. "If the bylaws protect him, we'll challenge them in court. If he's using trust funds to interfere in Charlotte's life, that's grounds for action." The team exchanged uncertain glances. but they nodded in agreement. As the meeting adjourned, Robert lingered behind. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you sure this is the best course of action? Your father won't go down without a fight." Madeline met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I don't care how hard he fights. This ends now." That evening, Charlotte received an unexpected call from Julia. "Hey, Char," Julia said, her voice hesitant. "There's something you should know. That guy who left the note, he came back." Charlotte's chest tightened. "What? When?" "About an hour ago," Julia said. "He didn't say much, just asked a lot of questions about you. We didn't tell him anything, but it was creepy." Charlotte thanked her and hung up, her hands trembling. She felt trapped, as if Edward's shadow was looming over every corner of her life. But she wasn't going to let him win. She picked up the journal Madeline had given her and opened it to one of the later entries. "One day, I hope you'll see how strong you are. You've always been stronger than I could ever be." The words settled in her heart, grounding her. For the first time, she realized she didn't have to face this alone. She dialed Madeline's number. "I'm in," Charlotte said when Madeline answered. "Whatever you're planning to stop him, I'll help." Madeline's voice softened. "You don't have to." "I want to," Charlotte interrupted. "This is my life, too." Madeline smiled faintly. "Then we'll face him together." As the call ended, Charlotte felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. Edward Harper had underestimated her, and he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. The morning sky was overcast as Charlotte and Madeline walked side by side toward the Harper Enterprises headquarters. Though the streets bustled with the usual energy of the city, an electric tension hung between them. For the first time, Charlotte felt a strange sense of solidarity with Madeline. They weren't just two strangers bound by blood. They were a team, standing together against the looming shadow of Edward Harper. Madeline glanced at her daughter, her expression resolute. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Charlotte met her gaze, her voice steady. "I've spent my whole life being pushed around by circumstances I didn't choose. It's time I take control." Madeline nodded, a glimmer of pride softening her stern demeanor. The conference room at Harper Enterprises was filled with Edward's trusted allies, board members, attorneys, and advisors who had long benefited from his influence. Edward sat at the head of the table, his presence as commanding as ever, though his eyes narrowed when Madeline and Charlotte entered. "Ah, the prodigal daughter and her guest," Edward said, his tone dripping with mockery. Madeline ignored the jab. Taking a seat across from him, Charlotte sat beside her, her posture straight and unyielding. "This meeting is about more than business, Father," Madeline began, her voice calm but firm. "It's about accountability." Edward smirked. "Accountability from you? Spare me the lecture, Madeline. What is this really about?" Madeline slid a folder across the table. "This is a comprehensive record of your recent actions, including your attempts to interfere in Charlotte's life. You've used trust funds for personal vendettas, violated ethical standards, and jeopardized the integrity of this company." Edward's smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "And what do you plan to do with this evidence?" "We're filing a motion to remove you as trustee of the Harper Family Trust," Madeline said, her tone unwavering. "Your actions have made you unfit to manage it." Murmurs rippled through the room as Edward's allies exchanged uneasy glances. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "You think you can take this from me? Everything I've built?" Charlotte spoke for the first time, her voice steady but laced with defiance. "You didn't build anything. You tore people down to make yourself bigger, but not anymore." Edward's eyes narrowed. "You're out of your depth." "Girl!" "No," Charlotte replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You are." Over the next hour, Madeline laid out her case with precision, presenting evidence of Edward's mismanagement and manipulation. The board members, once staunchly loyal to Edward, began to shift in their seats, their confidence in him wavering. Charlotte watched in awe as Madeline dismantled Edward's defenses. It was clear that this wasn't just about business. It was personal, and Madeline wasn't holding back. Finally, one of the senior board members spoke up. "Mr. Harper, these allegations are serious. If they're true, they could have significant legal and financial repercussions." Edward's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "You're all forgetting one thing. I've made this company what it is, without me. None of you would be sitting here today. That may be true, Madeline said, her voice cutting through the tension. But the company's future doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who work here, to the clients who trust us. And if we're going to move forward, we need to leave your corruption behind. Edward stood abruptly, his fists clenched. You're making a mistake, Madeline. You think you can take me down and walk away unscathed? I'll destroy you. Madeline rose to her feet, her expression calm but unyielding. You've spent your whole life trying to control people through fear, but you don't scare me anymore, and you don't scare Charlotte. Charlotte stood as well, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. You might have power, Edward, but you don't have us. Not anymore. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, one by one, the board members voiced their agreement to proceed with the motion. Edward's face was a mask of fury as the reality of his situation set in. Later that evening, Charlotte and Madeline sat together in a small cafe, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. I didn't think it was possible, Charlotte admitted. Stirring her tea, standing up to him felt impossible. Madeline smiled faintly. You did more than stand up to him, Charlotte. You proved that he couldn't control you. That's something even I struggled to do for years. Charlotte looked at her mother, a hint of warmth breaking through her guarded exterior. I couldn't have done it without you. Madeline reached across the table, placing a hand over Charlotte's. You've always been stronger than you realize. I'm just glad I finally got to see it. For the first time, Charlotte allowed herself to smile. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still wounds to heal, questions to answer, but it was a beginning. Maybe we can figure this out, Charlotte said softly. Madeline's eyes glistened with emotion. I'd like that. As they left the cafe and stepped into the cool night air, Charlotte felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she wasn't walking it alone.